Elliott is a large, comprehensive school in Putney, southwest London. As part of the celebrations to mark the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II, the school decided to reunite former students, those who had been at the school at the time of the war, with students at the school today. As the memory of the Second World War begins to slip into history, it seemed essential to hand on the baton to a new generation. The veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, came to Elliott for 2 days in May and June 2005 to talk with the students about their memories of the war. Most of the veterans were pupils at Elliott around the outbreak of war, and their stories are of evacuation, living through the bombings of London, shelters, rationing, and all the other perils of being on the home front. A few saw military service either during the latter stages of the war or subsequently during national service. But all the stories told were those of being young and having to live through a world at war. Elliott today is a large, successful educational community of 1,400 people. Exam results are good, and many students go on to university. But at the outbreak of war in 1939, things were very different. Indeed, Elliott School was not on the site of today's building. It was situated a couple of miles away in 3 Edwardian single-decker bungalow-style buildings in Southfields.
Did you have much awareness of what was happening around the outbreak of the war?
Oh yes, my primary school had a man very interested in history. He wasn't teaching me, but he got together groups of the senior boys in the school and took them into a classroom and very quietly explained that Germany was a rogue state in effect, and that they'd merged with Austria without force of arms but by subterfuge. And then he drew a map on the blackboard, or put a map up which showed the position of Germany and Austria. And then he said, now what's happening is that they're demanding part of Czechoslovakia, which is up here. They want all of it round the edge which faces Germany, because they're German-speaking people and Germany now claims them as their own. So it's taking over this. And the question is now, what will happen next? And he left that rather hanging. He said, I don't think that will be the end of the demands of Germany.
Tell me what happened when you were evacuated.
When I was evacuated, we came to school as usual on the Friday morning. That was the 1st of September. And we were told that we were going to go off. We weren't told where we were going, so we walked up to Southfield Station. We got on the bus, on the train from there to Wimbledon, and then we got on the train. We didn't know where we were going. We were just told that we were going off somewhere. We imagined that perhaps we might be going, perhaps somewhere like Wales, Cornwall, or somewhere a long way away. But in actual fact, about sort of 40 or 50 minutes later, we landed at London Road, Guildford. It wasn't Guildford main station, it was London Road, Guildford. And we were taken from there to the Guildford High School, where we were then paired off and taken off to our various homes. We were taken to one quite near. And then on the Sunday morning, war was declared. So we knew then that we would be staying, that we wouldn't be going back home again.
So how were evacuated children paired off with the families that looked after you?
I don't really remember quite how we were chosen. I think possibly if some people could take 3 children, then I had my friend and her sister, and I imagine that if people had got plenty of accommodation, then we were probably taken off then. I think it depended very much on how many the foster parents could take.
Did you have any first-hand experiences of the war in Guildford?
We had air raids, we had the sirens, but we didn't in actual fact have a great many bombs dropping or I think just on one occasion a bomb dropped in Guildford and one of the schoolgirls was injured, but we didn't actually have any experience of troop trains going through, as far as I know. I didn't myself have any experience of that.
Did the government have any plans for the education of children who are not evacuated when the war broke out?
At that stage, the government hadn't got any plans, and they put together some makeshift learning units. They weren't really schools, just teachers who, for a lot of reasons you can imagine, their own illness, their advancing years, or looking after a sick relative or something, were not away from London. And for various personal reasons, they couldn't be. And therefore, they were gathered together in a sort of ad hoc group, and all the kids, as we were then called, round about, sort of found out about them through the radio, I think, mainly than anything else. There were no telephones, newspapers were a bit scant, and that wasn't an important factor really at that stage. We just found out that locally something was going on and reported. And I think the government then started putting out more official demands that children attended. And these little groups of a teacher not knowing us, not knowing the school, not knowing the community, had a bunch of children of disparate ages and abilities, and put them in a group and began some kind of education.
I understand that the boys were evacuated to Woking. Did you go to school as soon as you arrived?
The first few months in Woking, I didn't go to school at all because we were being moved around and there was nowhere to put us. And then when we got the house near St John's, we were said you've got to start going to school, and we went to this house. And in this very, very large house in a very posh area of Woking, there was a large attic upstairs, an attic room, probably was the old servants' quarters. And there was a teacher up there with about 30 kids.
That doesn't sound much like a proper education. Did you take exams or anything?
I suppose I remember sitting an exam, which I later found out was the 11 plus, which I failed. They told me I failed, but they said, well, you're going to the Elliott School in St John's, which was a big old church school, very near the church, in St John's Village, not too far from where I lived.
I expect being an evacuee, living in someone else's house, wasn't always easy. Tell me about Mrs Spong.
Mrs Spong ran a guest house for people who worked in Woking, and it quickly became apparent that Mrs Spong had 6 unpaid helpers on her hand, as well as 6 evacuees. And very quickly we were helping to wash up and wipe up and clean the rooms. Not heavy cleaning, but just dusting and things like that. And unfortunately I didn't endear myself to Mrs Spong right from the second day, because playing as we did on the Basingstoke Canal, I unfortunately fell in and got wet through and had to go back to Mrs Spong, so I'm afraid Mrs Spong particularly didn't like me out of the 6 little boys.
When you were in Guildford, did you see much of a country at war?
We were backing onto the railway line, and the troop trains would come up and they would throw us out occasionally some chocolate or chewing gum. But we did have one bomb in the village which hit the village shop, and I don't remember the lady's name, but I do remember that when we went to school that day, the double bed was hanging out the front of the house, and we do understand she wasn't hurt, she was rescued.
Did you experience any bombing in Woking?
Until the V1s came, the doodlebugs as they were called, the first V1 bombers, they were indiscriminate and they targeted the home counties. In fact, we did have quite a few around Woking, and we had air raid shelters at the school, but I don't have a memory of using the air raid shelters very often or going into them very often. So the daytime raids weren't very bad in the area of Surrey where we were.
The Elliott evacuee girls arrived in Guildford on the 1st of September 1939, not knowing what to expect or where they would end up. There we began a day of discovery. We climbed Bright Hill to the old Guildford Central School for Girls, still standing high above the town, now an art and adult education centre. In this school hall, Mrs. Hewitson, the girls' school head, took assemblies from 1939 to 1941, and it was here where she fell off the stage, the first Elliott casualty of the war. In 1941, the girls said goodbye to their shared base on Bright Hill and moved across town to the far grander premises of Guildford House. This house was built in the 1860s by the parents of E.R. Shepherd, who, the evacuees were told, drew most of the illustrations for Winnie the Pooh in the room they later used as a library and classroom. We were welcomed by Lisanne Greenberg, the present owner. She told us that we were not the first Elliott students to visit the house, but we were certainly the youngest. Previous visitors had been Elliott wartime evacuees who had wanted to revisit the place where they had spent the last 3 years of the war.
What was it like in London when the daytime area had started?
It started up one Saturday afternoon. I was at my grandmother's place in Tooting, and we were up on the hill, and the first wave of the planes that came that did all the damage in the East End started coming over. And we stood in the back garden and watching them for a while, and see all fighter planes driving in and out of the bombers. It was quite interesting. They didn't come near us, fortunately, and I went off back home, back to Putney, and later on went down to the Putney riverside, and looking back down to the east, there was just smoke and all sorts of stuff going on, and it's obviously where they'd done the damage at the East End. After that, then the air raid sirens were going every night virtually.
There were things which you may know something about, called flying bombs. They were sort of pilotless bombs, really, and when the engine cut out, everybody sort of dived for cover, hoping there wouldn't be any explosions around that could cause a lot of damage. But it did a lot of structural damage in various parts, and most of the damage really was, as I said, superficial, mostly windows and roofs and things of that sort. But eventually they died out, and you know, life tried to get back to normal as best, you know, we could make it.
Unlike many young people, Eric Thompson stayed in London throughout the war.
The world carried on as best it could in London, for instance. People had to do things. People had to go to work, you had to have services, you had to have food, you had to have whatever transport was available. And people went about their business as much as they ever could. And of course, you get up in the morning and find that the road isn't there, or the house isn't there, or you've nowhere to go for the day because it's been blown up. But people adapted.
Jean Woodbridge and John Oakey were Elliott pupils before the outbreak of the war. They experienced the Blitz as adults.
Well, when I was in London, I worked first of all for a firm of surveyors, and they had a lot of clients who had bomb-damaged buildings. This is when the war was on. So I used to have to go out with one of the surveyors, go all around the buildings and take down shorthand notes, and then come back again. And then I had to take my turn fire watching in the evening, and I had to clamber over roofs of very big buildings so that I knew what to do in case of incendiary bombs.
I was in Upper Thames Street at the latter part of the war, it must have been about 42 or something, where the serious bombing had finished. But the bit that impressed me was that in Upper Thames Street there were all sorts of dealers in fur and perfumes and things. And when it rained, you could smell these lovely perfumes in Upper Thames Street. Most peculiar.
I say, while remembering potatoes, don't forget our old friend the carrot, will you? His price is down to 2p a pound.
During the war, food was rationed and it was difficult to get the everyday things of life. How bad were these shortages?
Oh, as far as shortages were concerned, it's almost true to say there was nothing. We subsisted, we didn't live. The food that we had was totally basic. It was enough to sustain us, but there was no fruit. All the produce was homegrown. Very little, of course, could be imported, and kids younger than me didn't know what a banana was. Just a word, for instance, just didn't come. And there was no, the clothes were rationed, and it was so meagre you could hardly buy a shirt. You just couldn't buy anything that was a consumer item, just not there.
It doesn't matter what sort of jacket or label it comes in. It's the same dried egg you've seen before. There's the same amount there too. Equal to 12 eggs for 1 and 9. Not bad, eh?
You were allowed about 1 egg a week. Meat was rationed by price, 1 and 8p worth of meat, I remember. There being about 6 in the house, you could have quite a big joint that you'd have it roasted on Sunday, and then the rest of the week it would be minced or done other things with, and then you'd have corned beef, and sausages weren't rationed, so one of the days you'd get sausages. And tin food was by points, and you were allowed so many points, but it was all very short, you just couldn't get it. So you just had what was going.
Were you aware of what was going on around you?
I think everybody was aware. News bulletins gave sanitised versions of events in the battlefronts. There was a BBC programme which gave an epic account in words, not of course pictures. There was no television, didn't exist, of events in battle where a particular British unit had had some success. It was purely propaganda, it was real enough, but it begged the question of how many failures and disasters there were. But propaganda is propaganda, and we listened to that avidly. We were showing the Germans something.
We used to have the news on incessantly. My mum always had the 6 o'clock news, lunchtime news, any news at all would coming in. We used to go to pictures to see the news. And when General Alexander came on, my mum was so happy, because her maiden name was Alexander. She was so happy about that. And then we went to Tobruk, we went to Mersa Benghazi. We followed the war as far as we could at the cinema, on the Movietone news, and in the newspapers.
Some Elliott veterans saw active service abroad. Stephen Henbury was a medical orderly in Italy.
I was called up for national service, and after initial training was transferred into the Royal Army Medical Corps, and was then posted to Italy. Because I was a non-combatant, I was allowed to act as an escort for 600 German prisoners of war being taken home, and they were put in a camp at Rimini, and I ended up by marching them off of the train in front of a queue of 600 German soldiers, some of whom were in their original military uniforms, including the officers in their peaked caps. And little me was carrying a rifle which I shouldn't have been carrying, in front of these Germans who were obviously going home very happily and singing at the tops of their voices.
Alan Rudge had a bizarre experience with German prisoners of war in England.
I've been in the army about 4 or 5 months in late '44, and we've heard since lots of stories about British prisoners escaping and getting away to Spain and places like that. But there were escapes in Britain, or attempted escapes. There was one succeeded in South Wales, in Bridgend, near where we live, but they were all recaptured within 3 or 4 days. But there was one instance when it came to the notice of the authorities that German troops, prisoners of war, were thinking of making a breakout, with thinking it would be successful, as there couldn't be many British troops left in the country. So they whipped us up sharply from our camp, and in armoured vehicles we drove to this camp in Cheshire and drove through there as a sort of show of strength to put the Germans off any ideas of escaping. Well, we drove through, there must have been 30 or 40 of our vehicles, out the far end, and then at that time, unknown to the Germans, they drove us round through the woods and then came in again to catch up with the rear end of the original party. Well, I think it fooled the Germans the second time, but after that, I think they began to get the idea, oh, I've seen that vehicle before, I've seen those guys before, and realised it was just a big bluff. But it seemed to have worked because there weren't any further breakouts as far as I'm aware, anyway.
I've seen pictures of the VE Day celebrations, but what was it like to be in central London on that day?
We walked back from Buckingham Palace having seen the King and Queen and Winston Churchill and various other people on the balcony, and we walked back and we sat on the pavement chatting till about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, or maybe even later than that, before we actually went home.
I was absolutely amazed that you could pack Piccadilly Circus, Trafalgar Square and Regent Street and the whole lot with a solid mass of people. It was just out of my comprehension. And of course the troops in uniform there were hugged and kissed and lauded, and as though each one of them was a hero in himself. And the whole lot was a massive party of euphoria, and it was unofficial. It was known that people were foregathering, and of course the Mall was packed, and the King and Queen came out on the balcony, and there was a great celebration and cheering, and I don't know what. It was pure relief.
Vic Reeves' experience of the war left him with mixed emotions.
Hand-to-hand fighting, anything heroic like that, no, I didn't see it. The London Irish Rifles that I left, yes, did. They were in Italy. After I left them, they went to Italy and had one awful time there, in North Africa and Italy. And I still occasionally meet one or two of them, and I was lucky, although I regret it. I regret I wasn't there and I didn't take part of it, and I feel a wee bit cheated in some ways that I wasn't there. But by and large, I was extremely lucky I wasn't there.
In that they all survived to this day, our Elliott veterans were all lucky. Many of their cohort were killed during the war, and each year Elliott veterans return to the school to join with today's students in an annual act of remembrance. The Elliott veterans have never forgotten their time at Elliott, and Elliott will never forget them.